The White House account books from 1861 through 1865 contain a strange irregularity that has troubled historians for well over 100 years. Amid the formal listings of aides, advisors, cabinet officials, and military leaders, one name surfaces again and again in records connected to the private living spaces. Yet this woman held no official position, drew no government wages, and left behind no sanctioned correspondence in the presidential files. Elizabeth Keckley, once enslaved and later the personal dressmaker and trusted confidant of Mary Todd Lincoln, was present during some of the most consequential and intensely private moments of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. She overheard discussions that helped steer the nation's destiny, cradled dying children in her arms, stood quietly in rooms where decisions of war and peace were forged away from public eyes, and saw the first family and moment of fragility that no camera ever preserved. When she finally ended her silence in 1868 with a deeply controversial memoir titled Behind the Scenes, the response was swift, hostile, and unusually coordinated. Copies of the book were systematically purchased and destroyed within weeks of its release, and she withdrew from public explanation. What followed were nearly 4 more decades of deliberate, carefully maintained silence, during which she refused to speak about what she had truly witnessed, heard, and understood during those blood-soaked years of the early 1860s. For decades afterward, a single question lingered in Washington society, murmured in parlors and debated behind closed doors in private clubs. What else did she know? What truths were so dangerous, so potentially ruinous to reputations and legacies, that they went to grave with her in 1907, sealed forever inside a mind that had already proven capable of guarding the confidences of the most powerful people in the United States? Before we continue with the story of Elizabeth Keckley, the woman who clothed the most influential family in America while carrying the burden of their darkest secrets, I need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel and turn on the notification bell, because the story you are about to hear has been buried, suppressed, and intentionally erased from the historical record for more than a century. And in the comments below, tell me which state you are listening from. I want to know where the seekers of truth are gathered tonight, because this story reaches into every corner of this nation. The needle glided through silk with mechanical precision. Each stitch was invisible to the naked eye, the tension flawless, the spacing exact. Elizabeth Keckley had learned this exacting technique under circumstances she preferred not to revisit, in a plantation house in Virginia, where errors were punished with violence, where young enslaved girls' hands were expected to be perfect or suffer consequences that left marks she still bore decades later. Pale white scars crossed her knuckles and the backs of her hands, lines she had long since learned to disguise through careful positioning. Now, at 37 years old, she sat inside a modest yet respectable dressmaking shop on 12th Street in Washington, D.C. She was a free woman, with a reputation that had reached into the highest circles of the capital. That reputation had been built stitch by painstaking stitch over years of labor that consumed her youth and nearly broke her spirit. The shop carried the scent of lavender sachets and clean cotton, a deliberate choice meant to disguise the coal smoke that hung over the city like a filthy veil. Outside, the spotless windows, arranged with tasteful displays of fabric samples and Parisian fashion plates, Washington itself was changing. It was no longer a quiet southern town, but the capital of a nation tearing itself apart at the seams. It was November of 1860, and even the air seemed charged with tension, compelling people to speak in low voices and glance nervously over their shoulders. South Carolina was openly threatening secession, holding emergency conventions where men in tailored suits argued over whether their allegiance to slavery outweighed their loyalty to the Union. Other slave states across the South were preparing to follow, and the newspapers overflowed with incendiary language promising bloodshed and ruin. And Abraham Lincoln, a former prairie lawyer from Illinois who much of Washington society dismissed as a crude frontier joke because of his height and ungainly manner, had just been elected president by a nation that had not even placed his name on the ballot in most southern states. Elizabeth had stitched her freedom together one careful seam at a time, dollar by agonizing dollar. She had bought her own liberty and that of her son, George, For $1,200, a sum that represented 17 years of sewing late into the night by lamplight that strained and damaged her eyes. It meant accepting commissions from women who looked straight through her, as though she were no more than furniture or wallpaper, enduring particular humiliation of being trusted with their bodies while being denied the most basic respect. She arrived in Washington in 1860 carrying letters of introduction from former clients in St. Louis, and a skill that transcended the color of her skin, even though it could never fully overcome it. Within months, she was sewing gowns for the wives of senators, cabinet officials, and military officers. These women praised her craftsmanship enthusiastically to their friends, yet never invited her to sit in their presence or offered her even a glass of water during long fitting sessions. Her hands never shook, even as she worked for women who spoke casually about the supposed inferiority of her race while she knelt at their feet, pinning hems and marking alterations with chalk. In slavery, she had learned what many free people never mastered: the ability to be present and invisible at the same time. She learned to hear everything while appearing to listen to nothing, to absorb information without revealing comprehension or judgment. It was a survival skill sharpened over decades in a world where showing too much intelligence or awareness could be dangerous, even deadly. On a cold afternoon in February 1861, the shop's door chimes rang, and Elizabeth lifted her gaze from her work to see a woman who seemed composed entirely of nervous energy and costly fabric. Mary Todd Lincoln swept into the room with the force of sudden storm, her hoop skirts occupying half the available space, her eyes flicking rapidly around the shop as if cataloging every detail for later use or searching for unseen dangers. She was shorter than Elizabeth had imagined from newspaper descriptions, with a round face that might have been pretty were it not for the tightness around her eyes and mouth, the expression of someone perpetually braced for criticism or betrayal. Mrs. Keckley. Her voice carried the softened tones of Kentucky, sharpened and polished by years of social striving in Springfield, Illinois, years spent proving herself worthy of a husband whose political ambitions had always outpaced his financial reality. "I've been told you're the finest dressmaker in Washington," she said. "Mrs. McLean spoke of you in the highest terms, and Senator Davis's wife insists you are the only modiste in this city who truly understands fashion. I sincerely hope that's true, because I have an impossible task for you, and I need someone who will not fail me." Elizabeth rose from her chair with practiced grace, her posture flawless, her expression carefully composed and professional. "I will do everything I can to meet your needs, Mrs. Lincoln. Please, have a seat and tell me what you require. I need an entire wardrobe, not just a few gowns, everything," Mary replied without hesitation. "Dresses for every conceivable occasion. State dinners, receptions, informal gatherings, morning calls, afternoon teas, evening entertainments. My husband is about to become President of the United States, and I will not be humiliated by appearing in anything less than the finest fashion." Mary Todd Lincoln stepped closer, and Elizabeth caught the scent of rose water mingled with something else, something medicinal, faintly bitter. She would later learn it was laudanum, the opium-based tincture so many women of the era relied upon for everything from headaches to heartbreak. "But here's the difficulty, Mrs. Keckley," Mary continued. "I need you to make me look as though I belong in the White House, as though I was born to be First Lady. And I need you to do it on a budget that wouldn't clothe a senator's wife for a single season. Can you do that? Can you make me look like what I must be?" It was the beginning of a relationship that would consume the next 4 years of Elizabeth's life and cast a shadow over the 42 years that followed. What began as a simple professional arrangement, dressmaker and client, with the usual boundaries and expectations, slowly evolved into something far more complicated and far more perilous. It was not friendship. The gulf of race and circumstance was too wide, too deeply etched by centuries of slavery and oppression. Instead, it was an intimacy born of proximity and shared secrets, of long hours spent in close quarters, of witnessed vulnerability and exchanged confidences. Elizabeth would spend more time in the private quarters of the White House than many cabinet members. She would hold Mary Lincoln's hand through grief that might have broken a stronger woman. She would see the president in moments of despair so deep he scarcely seemed human, reduced to raw anguish beneath the crushing weight of a war that devoured the nation's sons by the tens of thousands. And she would witness things never meant to be seen, hear conversations never meant to be overheard, and carry knowledge that would mark her as a target for the rest of her life. The first time Elizabeth entered the White House as Mary Lincoln's personal modiste, in March of 1861, she felt the building's peculiar energy at once. It was a place that functioned as both the nation's most public symbol and its most private home, where the boundary between government business and domestic life blurred in ways that produced constant tension. In 1861, the executive mansion was not yet the fortified stronghold it would later become. During certain hours, ordinary citizens could simply walk in from the street. Office seekers and petitioners crowded the corridors from early morning until late at night, and the line between public and private space was perilously thin. The president's office sat on the second floor, only steps in the family's living quarters, and the steady flow of politicians, military officers, and favor seekers made true privacy almost non-existent. Mary Lincoln's private rooms were also on the second floor, a suite she was already redecorating with intensity that bordered on obsession. She spent money that had not been formally appropriated, ordering draperies, carpets, furniture, china, and clothing in quantities that would later return to haunt her. Elizabeth would eventually understand that the constant buying was Mary's attempt to exert control over something, anything, in a world spinning beyond anyone's grasp, a way to impose beauty and order in the face of chaos and disintegration. "The newspapers call me a traitor because I was born in Kentucky," Mary said during one of their early fittings. She stood in her undergarments while Elizabeth pinned a bodice, her hands moving quickly and efficiently. "They say I'm a Confederate sympathizer, that I'm passing information to the rebels, that I can't be trusted because my family owns slaves. My own brothers are fighting for South. Did you know that? 3 of them joined the Confederate Army. One will die at Baton Rouge, another at Vicksburg, the third at Chickamauga. And people wonder why I can't sleep at night, why I need medicine just to get through the day." Elizabeth said nothing, her mouth occupied with pins, but she stored every word away in the mental ledger she was quietly assembling. She was learning that Mary Lincoln needed to talk, needed someone who would listen without judgment or gossip, someone who could not weaponize her confessions because her own position was too fragile. Elizabeth, shaped by slavery into the perfect confidant, understood instinctively how to keep secrets, how to create a space where powerful people felt safe enough to unburden themselves. War descended on Washington like a fever in the summer of 1861. Almost overnight, the city transformed into an armed camp. Soldiers filled the streets, their uniforms still crisp, their faces young and hopeful. Hospitals appeared in churches and public buildings, preparing for casualties everyone prayed would not come, yet feared were inevitable. The Potomac River became a corridor for military transport, and the sound of drums and marching boots turned into the city's constant rhythm. The White House itself was soon ringed with guards at every entrance, with sharpshooters stationed on the roof, scanning nearby buildings for threats. Elizabeth watched the president change during those first months of conflict. Abraham Lincoln had arrived in Washington as a lanky, awkward man who told jokes at inappropriate moments, who seemed ill at ease in formal clothing, who walked with an ungainly shuffle and spoke with a frontier accent that made polished Easterners wince. But the war reshaped him. In a single year, he aged a decade. His eyes grew haunted, a look that never fully left them, and his face became a map of suffering, deepening with every casualty report. One evening in August of 1861, Elizabeth was in the First Lady's private sitting room, adjusting one of Mary's gowns, when the president entered without knocking. His face was ashen with exhaustion, and with something darker still. He didn't seem to notice Elizabeth standing quietly in the corner, her arms filled with silken thread, as unseen as she had been trained to be. "They're calling a disaster," he said, his voice empty and defeated. "Bull Run. We thought it would be a swift victory, a simple show of force to bring the rebels back to their senses. to make him understand that the Union couldn't be undone by a vote. Instead, our boys ran. They broke and ran like frightened animals. Congressmen and their wives had gone out to watch the fighting, as if it were a spectacle, carrying picnic baskets and opera glasses. They had fled in panic when the army collapsed. And now McDowell is asking for more troops, more time, more of everything, Lincoln continued, rubbing a hand over his face. And I don't know if this nation has more to give. I don't know if I have more to give. Mary went to him at once, and Elizabeth watched as the First Lady guided her husband into a chair with unexpected tenderness, her hand steady on his shoulders, her voice low and calming. You'll find a way. You always do, Abraham. You've never failed at anything you truly set your mind to, have you? Lincoln looked up, and Elizabeth saw something in his expression that chilled her, a depth of doubt so profound it seemed to hollow him from the inside, leaving only to show the confident leader the public believed they knew. I'm sending men to die, he said. Boys, Mary, 18, 19 years old. Farm boys who've never been more than 20 miles from home. And for what? To force states to remain in a union they voted to leave. Sometimes I wake up at night and wonder if I'm the tyrant they say I am, if history will remember me as the man who destroyed the republic in order to save it. Elizabeth's hands went still against the fabric. She knew she was hearing something never meant for her ears, the private torment of a man who had to project unwavering certainty to a nation watching his every move. You're preserving the nation, Mary said firmly, her conviction surprising Elizabeth. And you're ending slavery. Don't forget that part, Abraham. Whatever else this war becomes, whatever political calculations you're forced to make, it's about that too. It has to be. Lincoln sat in silence for a long moment, his large hands dangling between his knees, his shoulders slumped. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I can't make it about slavery yet. Not openly. The border states would revolt. Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, Delaware, we'd lose them all, and then we'd lose the war. I have to wait for the right moment, the right victory, before I can make that proclamation. And in the meantime, men like Frederick Douglass call me a coward, a compromiser. And maybe they're right. Maybe I am choosing political convenience over moral necessity. Something shifted in Elizabeth's chest, a tangled mixture of emotions she couldn't fully name. She had always known the war was bound to slavery. How could it not be? The South had seceded precisely to preserve the institution that held her in bondage for the first 33 years of her life. But hearing the president speak of it in such measured, strategic terms, as a political instrument to be deployed at the proper moment rather than an immediate moral demand, filled her with a blend of hope, bitterness, and weary understanding. This, she realized, was how power truly functioned, not through grand moral declarations, but through calculation, timing, and compromise. She had never told Mary Lincoln the full truth of her enslavement, and she never would. She did not speak of being born in Dinwiddie County, Virginia, to an enslaved mother named Agnes and a white father, Armistead Burwell, who never acknowledged her existence. She did not speak of being loaned to her owner's son at 14 and enduring 4 years of systematic abuse that resulted in the birth of her son, George. She did not describe being beaten by a schoolmaster hired specifically to crush her spirit because her owner believed she was too proud, too intelligent, too aware of her own worth. She did not recount sewing her way toward freedom with fingers that sometimes bled onto cloth, leaving stains she had to hide or carefully explain away, or the 17 long years she spent saving the money to buy her own body and her child's. 17 years of being property while laboring to cease being property. The Lincolns knew she had been enslaved. Of course they did. It was part of her story, part of what made her acceptable in certain circles, the admirable former slave who had risen through talent and perseverance. But they did not know the texture of it. The daily humiliations and terrors had shaped her into someone capable of standing silently in a corner, listening to the president's despair without flinching, without offering comfort that was not asked for, without passing judgment. The autumn of 1861 brought a different kind of strain to Washington. The war had settled into what people were beginning to understand would be a long, grinding struggle rather than the swift resolution they had hoped for. Casualty lists lengthened with every engagement. Hospitals overflowed with wounded men. Ambulance wagons rattled endlessly through the streets. And Mary Lincoln's spending accelerated, as though she could somehow push back the encroaching darkness by surrounding herself with beauty. One October afternoon, as Elizabeth was fitting Mary for a new gown, the First Lady suddenly seized her wrist with surprising force, her fingers pressing hard enough to leave marks. "I need to tell you something," Mary said, her eyes bright and unfocused, almost feverish. "Something I can't tell anyone else. Something that would ruin me if it became public. Will you keep my confidence, Elizabeth? Will you swear it?" "Of course, Mrs. Lincoln," Elizabeth replied carefully, even as a part of her wanted to refuse, wanted to turn away from whatever weight was about to be placed upon her. "I'm in debt," Mary whispered. "Terrible debt. I've spent more than $27,000 redecorating the White House, and Congress only approved $20,000. I've been hiding the bills, delaying the merchants, making promises I can't keep. If Abraham finds out, if the newspapers find out, they'll destroy me. They'll say I'm frivolous and wasteful while soldiers are dying. And they'll be right, Elizabeth. They'll be right. But I can't stop myself. I can't stop buying things. Can't stop trying to make this place beautiful. Because if I stop, if I sit still for even a moment, I'll have to think about my brothers fighting against my husband, about half the country calling me a traitor, about the possibility that we could lose this war, and that everything would have been for nothing." Elizabeth felt a surge of anger rise within her, which she suppressed with effort, keeping her face composed and sympathetic. Mary Lincoln had spent in a single year more than Elizabeth had, earned in her entire lifetime, spent on luxuries she did not truly need, while Elizabeth had sown for 17 years simply to purchase ownership of her own body. Yet alongside the anger, she felt pity, because she could see that Mary was trapped in her own form of bondage, enslaved by insecurity, by an endless hunger for validation, by a consuming terror of judgment and failure. "I'll help you however I can, Mrs. Lincoln," Elizabeth said quietly, even though she had no idea what that help would ultimately require or what cost she would one day pay for offering it. The winter of 1862 brought a horror that eclipsed all political intrigue and financial anxiety. Willie Lincoln, the president's 11-year-old son, fell ill in early February. At first, it appeared to be nothing more than a routine childhood sickness, the sort of cold that usually passed with rest and attentive care. But as the days dragged on, the fever climbed relentlessly, and the doctor began to use ominous terms like bilious fever, what would later be understood as typhoid. It was likely contracted from the contaminated water supply serving the White House, drawn from the Potomac River downstream from sewage outlets. Elizabeth was present on the night Willie died, February 20th, 1862. She had been summoned to Mary's chambers to assist with an urgent alteration. Mary had insisted she needed a new dress for a reception, though everyone knew the event would be canceled if Willie's condition worsened. When Elizabeth arrived, she found the First Lady teetering on the edge of hysteria, surrounded by doctors and staff who appeared powerless in the face of her terror and grief. The sound Mary Lincoln made when her son died was something Elizabeth would carry into her nightmares for the rest of her life. It was not a scream, not exactly. It was something older, more primal, a raw, keening wail that seemed to rise from somewhere beyond language, beyond civilization itself. It was the sound of a mother breaking, and it filled the White House as though it were a physical force. The president had to lift his wife bodily from a room, and Elizabeth watched as this tall, ungainly man cradled Mary like a child, his own face contorted with grief so immense it seemed to age him another decade in a single instant. She heard him say, his voice cracking, "You must control yourself, Mary. You must, or you'll go mad. Think of Tad. Think of Robert. They need you." But Mary Lincoln did unravel in her own way. Not the dramatic, institutionalized madness that would come years later after the assassination, but a quieter disintegration. It showed itself in seances and compulsive spending, in paranoid accusations against staff members she believed were stealing from her or plotting against her, and in her inability to enter the room where Willie had died. During those months, Elizabeth became her anchor, the one person Mary trusted completely, the one presence that could calm her when grief threatened to swallow her whole. It was then that Elizabeth began to understand the true nature of her role. She was no longer merely a dressmaker. She was a confidant, a witness, a keeper of secrets, and, though she did not yet fully grasp it, a repository for truths that powerful people needed to unload but could never risk share with anyone who might turn them into weapons. One afternoon in May 1862, as Elizabeth was fitting Mary for yet another black mourning dress. Mary will wear nothing but black for more than a year. The First Lady suddenly seized her hand with desperate strength. "I've been attending seances," Mary whispered, her voice urgent and low. "There's a medium, Mrs. Laurie, who comes to the White House. She's helped me speak to Willie. I've heard his voice, Elizabeth. He's at peace." She swallowed hard. "He says he's happy. He wants me to stop grieving so much." Elizabeth kept her expression carefully neutral, though her heart sank. She had already heard whispers among the White House staff about these seances, spoken in uneasy tones. The idea of the First Lady of the United States consulting spiritualists during a time of national crisis was political dynamite, the kind of scandal that could undermine the president and arm his enemies. "Does the president know?" Elizabeth asked gently. "He's attended some of them," Mary replied. "He doesn't truly believe, but he indulges me because he thinks it comforts me." He sits there with that patient, sorrowful look while Mrs. Laurie channels Willie's spirit. Mary's grip tightened until it was painful. "But there's more. Mrs. Laurie has told me things. Warnings. She says there are people close to us who mean us harm. Conspirators inside the White House itself. People who want Abraham dead, who are working with the Confederates to destroy the government. She's given me names, Elizabeth, names of people I believe were loyal." A chill ran through Elizabeth that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. "Mrs. Lincoln," she began carefully, "perhaps these seances—" "You think I'm mad?" Mary snapped, releasing her hand abruptly. Her expression hardened. "Everyone thinks I'm mad, but I know what I know. There are people who want to destroy us, Elizabeth. And when this war ends, when Abraham has saved the Union, they'll come for us. They'll try to ruin us, to expose every mistake, every secret, every moment of weakness." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "And there are so many secrets, Elizabeth, so many things that can never be allowed to come to light." The words lingered between them, heavy with implication and quiet menace. Elizabeth wanted to ask what secrets Mary meant, but something in the First Lady's expression stopped her cold. Some doors once opened could never be shut again. Some knowledge was too dangerous to carry. The Emancipation Proclamation arrived in September of 1862, preliminary, cautious, and deeply limited. It applied only to states in rebellion, leaving slavery untouched in the border states that had remained loyal to the Union. Elizabeth read it in the newspaper with tears streaming down her face, sitting alone in her shop on 12th Street after her assistants had gone home. It was not enough. It did not free the enslaved in Kentucky, Maryland, or Missouri. It did not answer the deeper question of whether black people would ever be truly equal in America. It did not erase centuries of cruelty and violence. But it was something. It was a beginning, a crack in a wall that had once seemed unbreakable. She was at the White House the very next day and found the president in an unusually contemplative mood. He had come into Mary's chambers to check on the progress of a particular gown. He took a genuine interest in his wife's appearance, something that surprised many observers, often offering opinions on colors, fabrics, and styles. He stood by the window, gazing out over the city, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Keckley," he said suddenly, turning toward her, "you were born enslaved, were you not?" "Yes, Mr. President." "And you purchased your freedom, yours and your son's?" "Yes, sir. $1,200. It took me 17 years to earn it, working every day and most nights." Lincoln fell silent, his long fingers tapping softly against the windowsill. "I just signed a document that will free millions of people like you. Or at least, that is what I hope it will do. But I sometimes wonder whether a piece of paper can truly change what lives in men's hearts. Can it? Do you think a proclamation can undo centuries of hatred and fear?" Elizabeth chose her words with care, aware of how precarious the moment was. "A piece of paper gave me my freedom, Mr. President, but it did not make me free. That was something I had to claim for myself every day, by refusing to let slavery define who I was, by building a life, a business, and a reputation that had nothing to do with what I'd been and everything to do with what I chose to become. Your proclamation will give people the chance to do the same. Whether they are allowed to take that chance, whether this nation lets them, is a question that will define the next 100 years." Lincoln studied her, his expression hovering somewhere between respect and sorrow. "You are a wise woman, Mrs. Keckley, wiser than many of the men who advised me. I hope my wife understands how fortunate she is to have you." But Elizabeth did not feel wise. She felt like someone standing at the edge of a vast precipice, watching forces far beyond her control reshape the world, knowing that the changes ahead would be both miraculous and devastating. Freedom, she understood, would bring new struggles and new forms of oppression that no one yet knew how to name. The war dragged on through 1863 and into 1864. Elizabeth watched the casualty list grow longer as the president's face became more haggard and deeply lined, while Mary Lincoln's spending and paranoia spiraled further out of control. Elizabeth learned the full extent of the debts Mary had concealed, tens of thousands of dollars in clothing and furnishings, bills hidden from her husband, payments postponed, promises made to merchants in New York and Philadelphia who were becoming increasingly impatient. "You have to help me," Mary said one evening in early 1864, clutching Elizabeth's hands with desperate force, her eyes wild and unfocused. "I owe money to nearly every merchant in New York and Philadelphia. $50,000, maybe more. I've lost track. If Abraham isn't reelected, if we're forced to leave the White House, they'll come after me. They'll sue me, Elizabeth. The newspapers will destroy me. They'll say I bankrupted the nation while soldiers were dying. You have to help me figure out how to pay them. You're clever with money. You bought your freedom. Help me buy mine." Elizabeth felt a surge of anger rise within her, which she carefully suppressed, keeping her expression calm and sympathetic. Mary Lincoln had spent in 4 years more than most people earned in a lifetime, spending it on luxuries she did not need, while Elizabeth had labored for 17 years simply to buy ownership of her own body and her child's. Yet she also felt pity, because she could see that Mary was trapped in a cycle she could not escape, driven by impulses she did not fully understand and could not control. "I'll do what I can, Mrs. Lincoln," Elizabeth said, though she had no idea what that would entail, or that this promise would eventually pull her into a scandal that would devastate her reputation and destroy her business. The solution Mary ultimately devised was both desperate and revealing. She began selling access to the president, arranging meetings for office seekers and favor hunters in exchange for money she quietly used to pay down her debts. She facilitated discussions of presidential pardons and money changed hands. She accepted gifts from contractors seeking government business, from men who needed permits, licenses, or exemptions from military service. Elizabeth knew about all of it. She was present when the arrangements were made, standing silently in corners while Mary negotiated with men who spoke in cautious euphemisms about donations and considerations. She saw the money change hands, watched Mary emerge from these encounters with feverish triumph in her eyes and a purse heavier than when she had entered. And Elizabeth said nothing, because what could she say? Who would believe a black dressmaker over the First Lady of the United States? And even if she were believed, what would become of her? Her business would be ruined, her reputation shredded, and she might even be prosecuted as an accomplice. She was trapped in a web of complicity, a witness to corruption she was powerless to expose without destroying herself in the process. But there were other secrets as well, darker ones she only partly understood. There were late-night meetings with men whose names she never learned. Conversations conducted in whispers that stopped abruptly when she entered a room. Letters Mary burned immediately after reading, holding them over a candle flame until they crumbled into ash. Coded messages in newspapers that Mary read with intense concentration, her lips moving silently as if deciphering a hidden language. One night in March of 1864, Elizabeth was working late in Mary's chambers, finishing a gown needed for a reception the following day, when she overheard a conversation that sent a cold shock through her body. Mary was meeting with a man Elizabeth had seen before, but never been introduced to, a well-dressed gentleman with a southern accent who seemed to have unusual access to the First Lady's private rooms. "The situation is becoming untenable," the man said in a low, urgent voice. "Your brother's deaths have earned you a measure of credibility, but there are still those who suspect. If certain letters were to surface, if certain financial transactions were examined too closely, the consequences would be severe." "I've destroyed everything that could be traced back to me," Mary replied, her voice tight with strain. "And anyone who knows the full extent of it is either dead or too compromised to speak." "What about your dressmaker, the colored woman?" the man asked. "She's here constantly. She must see and hear things." There was a pause. There was a long pause, and Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as she stood motionless behind a folding screen, her needle frozen in midair. "Elizabeth is loyal," Mary said at last, "and she's intelligent enough to understand that her position depends on her discretion. She will not speak." "For her sake," the man replied quietly, "I hope you're right. These are dangerous times, Mrs. Lincoln, dangerous for all of us." Elizabeth never learned what that conversation truly concerned, what letters Mary had destroyed or what financial dealings the man was referencing, but she understood enough to know that she carried dangerous knowledge. Her closeness to power had made her visible in ways she had never intended, a potential liability to people who would not hesitate to remove a threat. The president's re-election in November of 1864 brought a brief reprieve from the crushing financial pressure. Mary's debts could be managed, deferred, concealed for another 4 years. The war itself was drawing to a close. Sherman had taken Atlanta and was marching to the sea, leaving devastation in his wake. Grant was grinding Lee's army down in Virginia, trading lives at a pace that horrified the nation but steadily, relentlessly, brought the conflict to its end. There was a growing sense that the bleeding might finally stop, that the unimaginable sacrifice might soon be over. Elizabeth was at the White House on the afternoon of April 14, 1865, Good Friday. She had come to deliver a dress and was struck by the atmosphere, which felt strangely light, almost buoyant. The war was over. Lee had surrendered at Appomattox just 5 days earlier, and the remaining Confederate forces were collapsing one by one. That evening, the President and Mrs. Lincoln planned to attend theater, a comedy titled Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater, only a short walk from the White House. "Come, help me dress," Mary said, pulling Elizabeth into her chambers with unusual energy. "I want to look beautiful tonight. Abraham has been burdened for so long, worn down by the weight of this terrible war. I want him to see me as I was when we first met, young, pretty, full of hope. I want him to remember why he married me, before all of this, before the war, the death, the madness." Elizabeth helped her into a black and white striped silk gown, one of the finest she had ever made, with intricate pleating and delicate lace trim. Mary stood before the mirror, turning slowly from side to side. For a fleeting moment, she looked almost happy, almost like the young woman she must once have been, before ambition and tragedy etched lines into her face. "Do you think he'll win them over?" Mary asked suddenly, meeting Elizabeth's eyes in the mirror. "The Southerners, he wants to be generous in victory, to heal the nation instead of punishing the rebels. With malice toward none, with charity for all," he said in his inaugural address. "But there are so many in his own party who want vengeance, who want to grind the South into dust. They'll fight him, Elizabeth. Even now, Even after everything he's done, they'll fight him. The president has won every battle so far, Elizabeth said, smoothing a fold of fabric at Mary's waist. Has he? Mary's expression darkened, the brief happiness draining away. Or has he simply been lucky? Mrs. Laurie warned me, at our last seance just 2 days ago. She said there was danger around him, a darkness she couldn't see clearly. She told me to keep him close, to keep him safe. I beg him not to go tonight, but he insists. He says the people need to see him, need to know that life can be normal again, that we can enjoy simple pleasures. Elizabeth felt a faint prickle of unease, but she dismissed it as she had learned to dismiss most of Mary's fears and premonitions. Mary was always sensing omens, always convinced catastrophe lurked nearby. It was exhausting to treat every anxiety as a genuine threat. You both deserve an evening of enjoyment, Elizabeth said firmly, pinning a brooch at Mary's collar. Go to the theater. Laugh. Let the nation see that their president is human, that he can enjoy a simple comedy after years of tragedy. Elizabeth would replay that conversation in her mind for the rest of her life, wondering if she could have said something different, done something, anything, to change what followed. Rationally, she knew there was nothing she could have done, but knowledge does not erase regret. The news reached her in the early hours of April 15th, just after midnight. A frantic pounding on her door, her neighbor's voice shaking with disbelief. Mrs. Keckley, wake up. The president's been shot. They say he's dying. Someone shot him at the theater. Elizabeth ran through the darkened streets toward the White House, her heart slamming against her ribs, her breath coming in painful gasps. The building was chaos. Soldiers everywhere, officials rushing in and out, and cutting through it all like a blade, Mary Lincoln screams, high and terrible, echoing from somewhere inside. They would not allow Elizabeth into the boarding house across from the theater, where the president had been carried, where he lay dying in a bed too small for his long body. She stood in the street among a silent crowd, watching the windows, waiting for news everyone knew was coming but no one wanted to hear. When the president died at 7:22 that morning, the wail that tore from Mary Lincoln was the same sound Elizabeth had heard the night Willie died. That raw, inhuman keening, the sound of something shattered beyond repair. The days that followed blurred together. Black crepe and funeral preparations, a stunned nation struggling to comprehend the murder of a president who had just won the war, who had seemed poised to heal the country's wounds. Elizabeth dressed Mary in mourning clothes and watched as the First Lady sank into a grief so profound she could not attend her husband's funeral. She could not leave her room. She could not function in any recognizable way. Mary remained secluded for 5 weeks after the assassination, refusing to emerge, while the new president, Andrew Johnson, waited with barely concealed impatience for her to vacate the White House. Elizabeth was one of the very few people permitted to see her during that time, and what she witnessed was a complete collapse, a woman who had held herself together through sheer force of finally coming apart. "They're saying I was involved," Mary whispered one afternoon, clutching Elizabeth's hand with fingers that felt almost skeletal. "The newspapers are suggesting that I knew about the plot," Mary whispered, "that I was in communication with the conspirators. They're saying my Southern sympathies, my brothers fighting for Confederacy, it all adds up to treason. They're going to destroy me. Elizabeth, they'll take everything I have and leave me with nothing." "No one believes that, Mrs. Lincoln," Elizabeth said softly, though she was no longer certain it was true. The papers were already overflowing with wild speculation and conspiracies, and Mary's name appeared in far too many of them. "Don't they?" Mary replied bitterly. "I'm not so sure. There are things I did, Elizabeth, things I'm not proud of. The debts, the spending, the arrangements I made. If they investigate too closely, if they start asking the wrong questions, they'll find enough to confirm their worst suspicions." It was during this period, at the very depths of Mary's grief and paranoia, that she made a request that would alter Elizabeth's life forever. "I need you to help me sell my clothes," Mary said one afternoon, her voice flat, drained of emotion. "All of them. The dresses, the jewelry, the shawls. Everything. I'm destitute, Elizabeth. Abraham left me almost nothing. Just a small pension that won't even touch my debts. I have to raise money somehow, and my clothes are all I have. You have to help me. You're the only person I can trust." Elizabeth stared at her in disbelief, horror creeping into her chest. "Mrs. Lincoln, you can't sell your clothes. The newspapers would." "I don't care about the newspapers." Mary shrieked, the first real emotion Elizabeth had seen from her in days. "I don't care about anything except survival. Don't you understand? I'm going to be destroyed either way. At least if I sell my clothes, I might pay my debts. I might avoid complete ruin. Will you help me or not?" Against her better judgment, against every instinct warning her that this was a catastrophic mistake, Elizabeth agreed. Over the next 2 years, from 1867 to 1868, she traveled repeatedly to New York, attempting to sell Mary Lincoln's wardrobe to brokers and collectors. The process was humiliating and degrading, exposing both women to ridicule and public scorn. The newspapers delighted in it. The widow of the martyred president reduced, they sneered, to peddling her used clothing like a common peddler, like a woman of the street forced to sell her possessions to survive. Worse than the humiliation, however, was what Elizabeth discovered along the way. As she sorted through Mary's belongings, cataloging dresses, jewelry, and shawls, she uncovered tangible evidence of the financial improprieties she had only glimpsed before. Receipts hidden in pockets, letters folded into bodices, documents that revealed the full scope of Mary's corruption during the White House years. With a sickening realization, Elizabeth understood that Mary had drawn her into the clothing scheme, not merely for assistance, but to secure her silence. If Elizabeth ever spoke, Mary could claim she had been complicit, that she had profited from the corruption, that she was equally guilty. It was a trap, and Elizabeth had stepped into it willingly, blinded by loyalty, pity, and misplaced sense of obligation. By 1868, Elizabeth had reached her breaking point. The clothing sales had failed spectacularly, raising only a fraction of what Mary needed, while publicity proved disastrous. Mary Lincoln turned on her, accusing her of theft and betrayal, claiming Elizabeth had mishandled the sales and kept money that belonged to her. The woman Elizabeth had served faithfully for 7 years now refused to speak to her, spread vicious rumors, and threatened legal action. In response, Elizabeth did something that would follow her like a shadow for the rest of her life. She wrote a book, Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House, was published in April of 1868. Her aim was to defend herself against Mary's accusations and tell her own story. The story of a woman who rose from slavery to become a confidant to the most powerful family in America, who witnessed history from a vantage point no one else shared. She included details of her time in the White House, conversations she had overheard, private moments she had witnessed, and candid descriptions of Mary's character and behavior. The backlash was immediate, organized, and brutal. The white press labeled her ungrateful and treacherous, a betrayer of sacred confidences who had violated the unspoken bond between servant and employer. They claimed she proved black people could not be trusted with access to white society, that granting formerly enslaved people too much opportunity would inevitably lead to betrayal. The black press was divided. Some praised her courage in telling her story. Others argued she had violated an unspoken code, confirming white America's worst fears about allowing black people into positions of trust and influence, and making it harder for others to follow in her path. Mary Lincoln never spoke to her again. Most of Elizabeth's wealthy white clients abandoned her, unwilling to risk their private lives being exposed in a future memoir. The book failed commercially. Many copies were quietly purchased and destroyed by Mary's allies and members of the Lincoln family, who wanted to suppress its revelations and protect the martyred president's legacy. But the most haunting part, the burden Elizabeth would carry for the remaining 40 years of her life, was not what she revealed, but what she left out. The true secrets, the financial corruption, the selling of access and pardons, the seances and paranoia, the president's private moments of despair and doubt. The mysterious late-night meetings and coded messages. The hints of connections to Confederate sympathizers. All of that she kept to herself. The book was controversial enough with the relatively mild details it contained. Had she revealed everything she knew, everything she had seen, heard, and understood, it would have destroyed Mary Lincoln completely and likely stained Abraham Lincoln's legacy beyond repair. So Elizabeth made a choice. She would keep the real secrets, the dangerous ones, the kind that could fundamentally alter the historical understanding of the Lincoln presidency, locked inside her for the rest of her life. The years following the book's publication were harsh in ways Elizabeth had never known, even in slavery. At least in bondage, she had known where she stood, had understood the rules and the boundaries. Now she existed in a kind of limbo, free, yet not truly free, with her reputation in ruins and her livelihood destroyed. Her dressmaking shop closed within a year. She lived on the edge of poverty, taking in sewing when she could find it, doing alterations and repairs for women who would never invite her into their homes, surviving on the occasional charity of friends and former clients who remained loyal despite the scandal. Her son George had died during the war, killed in August 1861 at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri while fighting for the Union. It was a cruel irony that the only child she had labored 17 years to free was taken by the very conflict meant to bring freedom to people like them. She was left alone in the world, with no family, few friends, and a burden of secrets that grew heavier with each passing year. She never wrote another book. She never gave interviews about her time in the White House. She never spoke publicly about the Lincolns again. When people asked her about those years, she smiled politely and changed the subject, deflecting questions with practiced ease. The knowledge she carried became heavier over time, shaping her into someone increasingly isolated, someone who had learned that knowing too much could be its own kind of curse. In 1892, 24 years after the publication of her book, a journalist tracked Elizabeth down to the small rented room where she was living in Washington, barely surviving on sewing work and the occasional small donation from former clients who still remembered her. He wanted to interview her about the assassination, about the conspiracy theories that had multiplied over the decades, about the persistent rumors that Mary Lincoln had been involved in some way. "There are people who say Mary Lincoln was involved," the journalist said, pencil poised above his notebook, his eyes bright with anticipation. That she knew about the plot, that her Southern sympathies and her brothers fighting for the Confederacy made her vulnerable, that she was passing information to the South throughout the war. "You were there, Mrs. Keckley. You knew her better than almost anyone. You saw things no one else saw. What do you think? Was Mary Lincoln traitor?" Elizabeth looked at the young man, so eager for sensational revelation, so certain he could uncover a truth that had eluded everyone else, and felt a wave of exhaustion so deep it was almost physical. She could have told him about Mary's crushing debts and her desperate need for money, about the strange man who came and went from the White House in those final weeks, about conversations that seemed harmless at the time but felt sinister in hindsight. She could have spoken of the seances where warnings were given, of Mary's insistence that conspirators were close to the president, of how Mary had seemed almost unsurprised when news of the assassination arrived. She could have told him about the letters burned, the coded messages in newspapers, the Southern gentleman who spoke of documents and transactions that could never be allowed to surface. She could have told him about the night she overheard an argument about plans and timing, about making sure no traces remained. But what good would it do? Mary Lincoln was dead, having passed in 1882, broken and alone in her sister's house in Springfield, her mind finally consumed by grief, guilt, and whatever secret she carried to her grave. Abraham Lincoln had become a martyr, a near-sacred figure whose legacy was still being contested by politicians and historians, a symbol of national unity and moral purpose. The nation had survived the war and was struggling, imperfectly, incompletely, to heal. What purpose would be served by reopening old wounds? By suggesting that the martyred president's wife might have been complicit in his murder? By tarnishing the memory of the man who preserved the Union and struck the decisive blow against slavery? "I think," Elizabeth said at last, choosing her words with the same care she had once used to place flawless stitches, "that Mrs. Lincoln loved her husband in her own complicated way. And I think grief and guilt can appear very similar from the outside. People who are grieving often behave in ways that seem suspicious or strange to those who do not understand the depth of their pain. That is all I have to say on the matter." The journalist left disappointed. Elizabeth returned to her sewing, her hands moving with the same steady precision they had known for more than 60 years. Long ago, she had chosen to be a keeper of secrets rather than a revealer of truths, to protect the dead even when they had not protected her in life. It was a choice that cost her dearly, but it was the only one she could live with, the only one that allowed her to sleep at night. Elizabeth Keckley died on May 26, 1907, at the age of 89, in the Home for Destitute Women and Children in Washington, D.C., a charitable institution for the poor and elderly. The woman who had once dressed the First Lady of the United States ended her days in poverty and obscurity. She had outlived everyone from those White House years: the Lincolns, the cabinet members, the generals and politicians who had shaped the war and its aftermath. She lived long enough to see the promise of Reconstruction betrayed, to watch Jim Crow laws impose a new form of bondage on her people, to witness the slow erasure of the hopes that had briefly flourished after emancipation. In her final years, she sometimes spoke of the Lincolns to other residents of the home, but always in vague, gentle terms. "Mrs. Lincoln had such refined taste," she would say. Or, "The president was a kind man, kinder than people realized." She never revealed the secret she had carried for half a century, never unburdened herself with the knowledge that had made her both privileged and cursed, both insider and outsider, both witness and accomplice. When she died, she left behind almost nothing: a few pieces of furniture, some sewing supplies, and a small trunk of papers that she requested be burned without being read. The staff honored her wishes, and whatever final secrets those papers contained, letters, diary entries, documents that might have answered questions historians would debate for generations, were reduced to ash, lost forever. But the questions remained, passed down through generations of scholars and historians, whispered in lecture halls and debated in journals and popular books. What had Elizabeth Keckley truly witnessed during those 4 years inside the White House? What had she known about Mary Lincoln's financial dealings, about the corruption and influence peddling that unfolded behind closed doors? Had she overheard conversations that would have fundamentally altered how we understand Lincoln's presidency? Did she possess knowledge about the assassination that she carried silently to her grave? Was Mary Lincoln involved in the plot? Or was she simply a deeply troubled woman whose behavior was later twisted by those hungry for conspiracies? The truth is, we will never know. Elizabeth Keckley made a choice to protect the people she had served, even when they betrayed her, even when speaking out might have cleared her name, brought her financial security, or secured her a permanent place in history. She chose silence over revelation, loyalty over truth, protection over justice. That decision defined the final 40 years of her life and shaped her into a woman who carried the weight of history on shoulders that had already borne the crushing burden of slavery. There's a photograph of Elizabeth from her later years, taken sometime in the 1890s. She sits perfectly upright in a high-backed chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression is calm, almost serene, yet distant. Her eyes look directly at the camera, but they seem to be focused on something far beyond the photographer, beyond that moment in time. Perhaps she was looking back on those years in the White House, on the secrets she carried, on the choices she made, and the prices she paid for them. Those eyes had seen a president in his darkest hours of despair. They had watched him wrestle with decisions that would determine the fate of millions. They had witnessed a First Lady unravel into grief, obsession, and corruption. They had seen the private face of power, stripped of ceremony and dignity, exposed in all its human weakness and fear. They had seen things that were never meant to be seen, heard conversations never meant to be overheard, understood connections and implications never meant to be understood. and they had kept those truths locked away. Even when revealing them might have changed history. Even when they might have altered our understanding of the Civil War, the Lincoln presidency, and the assassination that stunned a nation. In the end, Elizabeth Keckley's greatest act of courage was not buying her freedom, not building a successful business in society determined to keep her subordinate, and not even writing her controversial memoir. It was her silence, the deliberate, conscious decision to carry certain truths to her grave, to protect people who had not protected her, to preserve a version of history that was incomplete, but perhaps more bearable than the full truth would have been. She was a woman who knew too much and said too little, a woman who stood at the very center of American history and chose to remain in the shadows, someone who held the power to reshape historical narratives and chose not to use it, and the secret she guarded for 50 years died with her, leaving us to wonder what truths were lost when that small trunk of papers was burned. What revelations might have changed everything we think we know about the Civil War, the Lincoln presidency, the assassination, and the woman who dressed the First Lady while the nation tore itself apart and tried to stitch itself back together again. What do you think of Elizabeth Keckley's story? Do you believe she made the right choice by keeping those secrets, or should she have revealed everything she knew, regardless of the consequences? Was her silence an act of loyalty or a betrayal of historical truth? And what do you think was really inside that trunk of paper she ordered destroyed? Personal letters or evidence of something darker, something that would have changed everything? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I want to know what you think. What theories you have about what she truly knew. And if this story gave you chills, if it made you think about the price of proximity to power and the unbearable weight of secrets that can never be spoken, then hit that like button. Share this video with someone who loves dark historical mysteries, and subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more stories like this. Because history is not always what we are taught in school. Sometimes the most important truths are the ones that were deliberately buried, the ones that died with the people who knew them. Until next time, keep questioning what you think you know.